Tonight we're going to kick off a new theme for our Sanganites, which we're calling Stories of the Path. So we'll be using stories to illustrate and to give depth to increase our understanding of what we call the 5 aspects of the spiritual path, the 5 aspects of the spiritual path. And tonight I'm going to illustrate something about, particularly, I'm going to introduce those 5 aspects, and I'm also going to illustrate something about the first of them, integration, using Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as our story, or aspects of it. It's a very long story, you can tell the whole thing. So I'll be saying a bit about the story in general, but also picking up one particular incident that I think really does sort of say something about the first of these aspects. So the 5 aspects of the spiritual life. Okay. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. Oh, it's never that easy, is it? So I don't know if, can I share my screen? It's all so difficult. Oh, I give up. I give up. I did this last time. I just can't. Under the pressure of events, I can't do it. I'm not that technologically anyway. So the 5 aspects of the spiritual life, you're just going to have to remember them. The 5 aspects of the spiritual life are integration. Ah, yes, they come up here. Integration, Vicky. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. So integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And don't worry if those terms don't immediately mean anything to you. You'll get a better idea tonight and as we go along about what they mean. The first thing to say about this list is that it is not a list we get from the Buddha or even from the Buddhist tradition. Although all these elements are very, very clearly there in the Buddha's teaching. So it was Sangharakshita, the founder of Triratna, who came up with this list, which is a way of, as it were, making sense of what a lot of Buddhist practice is about, what it's getting at. And these 5 aspects, well, they're not some novel teaching. They're a description of the way a human being grows. In exactly the same way that you could describe the way a plant grows by saying, well, first of all, the seed needs to erupt with a root, etc., etc. You could describe that right up to the blossoming, and this is a description of the way we human beings grow. And just very briefly, very briefly, these 5 aspects. So, firstly, integration. To develop spiritually, we need to become a whole person rather than a divided person in conflict with ourselves. So we need to get to know the whole of ourselves. I really need to say something about this before we start, because otherwise you won't know what I'm talking about. We need to get to know the whole of ourselves. We need to bring these different parts together into a harmonious whole. So they're all pulling in the same direction. That's what we call integration, which means making whole. And I think we could say this first stage, we could call this first stage becoming an individual. And then if we're going to progress, we also need to become a person who is more motivated by positive emotions like metta and gratitude that connect us to others and the world around us, rather than being motivated by negative emotions that trap us in a sort of small version of ourselves and cut us off from others. So this is a stage of positive emotion. We could say it's about having become an individual, it's about becoming a connected individual. And then if we're going to change in a positive direction, we need to be willing to let go of our old ideas of ourselves, our old ideas and opinions and attitudes, so that a new, larger self can arise. So in a sense, the old self needs to die. Maybe this needs to happen many times. There needs to be a spiritual death, so that something new can come into existence, a spiritual rebirth. And ultimately, the Dharma tells us we need to go beyond, completely beyond the idea of ourselves as a separate individual anyway, becoming something much larger, something more expansive, more universal. We're still ourselves, but something larger than us is acting through us, the enlightened mind, acting through us for the good of all, to enrich and beautify the world. So that needs a spiritual death of the old individual, big spiritual death, and a big spiritual rebirth. And running through that whole process is the last of the 5 aspects, receptivity. We need to be receptive to find out new things about ourselves, open to acknowledging parts of ourselves we didn't know existed, our heights, our depths, open to a new self that might emerge that we don't even know what it is. We need receptivity at every stage of the path, or we're stuck. And tonight I'm going to use the Lord of the Rings, in particular, one particular story from the Lord of the Rings, to talk a little bit, to illustrate a little bit about the first of these aspects, integration, becoming an individual, becoming a whole person. So before I do that, I think I need to say something about what integration means, because I was in a group last week, I think a couple of weeks ago, and somebody was saying, well, you know, my ideas of integration are like racial integration, integration of the races, as in the American civil rights struggle, or integration as in calculus. What do we mean by integration? I think in Triratna, integration is a sort of psychological term, is a bit of jargon. And we know, if we've been in Triratna for a while, we know what it means. But it's not obvious to everybody. As I said, what it means basically is becoming an individual. We don't start out life as an individual. We start as a sort of loose bundle of conflicting desires and fears and reactions and drives, many of which are completely unconscious. We don't even know they're there until they rule us, until we act upon them in some way. So we're not in charge. We're not in charge. We're not in charge of ourselves, and we're not in charge of our life, because there is nobody there to be in charge. There is no sort of higher self to be in charge. So all these different aspects are competing. We have no overall direction, no overall sense of meaning. We're at the mercy of passing moods, passing desires, passing reactions, passing drives. If you want to see what non-integration looks like, look at a child or look at a dog. They're very lovable, but they just sort of, whatever grabs their attention. And Sangha actually, I think, has called non-integration doggy consciousness. Well, we're not quite like that. We're not like that. But we still get shown our lack of integration when, for example, we make a resolution, really meaning it. I'm really going to do this. I want to do this. And then later we decide not to do it because one part of ourselves made that resolution and we really, really meant it. But then later on, a different part was in the driving seat and that just didn't agree. The same thing happens with promises we don't keep, with commitments we don't honor, etc., etc. We get shown our lack of integration when we find ourselves in the grip of a mood that we don't want to be in. It's not very helpful or constructive. So we might decide we go off to see our mother or our father, or maybe we're with our spouse, and we decide to be loving and friendly and supportive. And instead, we find ourselves sulking. What's going on? We're not in charge. Or when we find ourselves being manipulated by others because we've got buttons that others can press that we don't even know are there. And of course, one big result of lack of integration is that we don't really feel we achieve much. Integrated people make things happen because they've got all their energies under their control. Even their deep primal energies, animal energies that could be destructive, are at their service. And I think a really good image for that is the image of the centaur. part horse, part animal. There's all that animal strength and energy, but being ruled by a human in control. So, yes, integration. Firstly, we need to, how do we do it? Firstly, we need to get to know ourselves. We need to become aware of what drives us and our sub-personalities, if you like. And we need a metaphor awareness of those, not try to force those different parts of ourselves to toe the line. And we also need, as it were, find a higher part of ourselves, a part of ourselves that exists on a higher level than all our competing ego drives. There needs to be something in charge, and it needs to be higher. There needs to be a king or queen in our kingdom. And meditation is, of course, the spiritual practice that helps us do both of these. It helps us to become aware of what's going on in our mind, and it helps us to find, if you like, a higher self. Because in meditation, if we persist with it, we can experience states in ourselves which are just higher than our normal state of mind, states of great joy and beauty and refinement and illumination and inspiration, which connect us to something in the universe higher than our own small self. And these states exist. Lots of people here connected up tonight will have experienced them. I'm not making this up. And when we experience these states, we begin to find this higher self in ourselves that can be in charge. Something higher than our ego drives. So, as I said, that's rather a long introduction, but I'm going to try to illustrate something about integration using a modern myth that quite a lot of us are aware of, the Lord of the Rings. If you think it's pure rubbish, bear with me, especially if that's on the basis of the film, where most of the meaning was sacrificed for long action sequences. So, a brief version of the plot. The main character is one Bilbo Baggins, a member of a class of beings called hobbits. And hobbits are amiable enough, but they are self-indulgent, especially with food and drink. They have a very limited view of the world, and if they can at all manage it, they avoid any sort of challenge in favor of cozy comfort, any sort of challenge or adventure. If left to themselves, they just live a cozy, comfortable life, and they don't do anything at all remarkable. They are also deeply conventional. They distrust anything or anyone out of the ordinary, and they dislike anyone whose view of the world is bigger than theirs. Some might say, I didn't say this, but some might say that hobbits are a bit like the nicer type of Daily Mail reader. But by chance, Frodo the Hobbit comes into possession of a great magical ring, a ring that gives immense power, but which corrupts and corrodes the character if it's used, especially if it's used for selfish ends. And the Dark Lord, Sauron, is desperately searching for this ring of power. And if he gets it, it will allow him to enslave the whole world and plunge it into a long era of darkness. The only way to stop this is to destroy the ring, to throw it into the fires of the volcano Mount Doom, which is at the very heart of Sauron's terrible kingdom. And only Frodo can do this, because the ring would destroy anyone else who owns it. So he can't give it away. But making that long journey through the wilderness to Mordor, sneaking into Mordor, climbing Mount Doom, with terrible creatures hunting for him, looking for him, all of the power of the Dark Lord looking for him, that is a challenge about 1,000,000 times bigger than any hobbit could remotely think about doing. But Frodo sees that he needs to try it anyway, or the world will be turned into a sort of hell. He doesn't think he has any chance of succeeding. He sets off. So Frodo sets out to take the ring to Mordor. He passes through some terrifying challenges and periods of horrendous suffering that are completely beyond anything he would normally imagine he could cope with. But with the help of the magician Gandalf and his faithful servant Sam, and a company of sort of rather archetypal beings who have been chosen to be his companions in the company, well, he discovers resources in himself that he didn't know he had. And eventually he does manage to throw the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, but only because the horrible creature, Gollum, bites the finger from his hand. More about Gollum later. And alone, Frodo doesn't have the willpower to destroy the ring. So Sauron's power is destroyed, a shadow is removed from the world, a new golden age of Middle-earth is ushered in, the world's transformed, period of order and harmony. Frodo has discovered and integrated resources in himself that he didn't know he had. The old person has died and be reborn. He becomes an honoured figure among the great people of Middle-earth, and eventually returns to the parochial, narrow world of the hobbits, a completely different person, a much bigger person. And the hobbits in the Shire, they tend to think he is mad and they avoid him. But his friends and all the people of wisdom in the world, the ones who really matter, they know that he has become a truly remarkable person. He's been transformed and the world has been transformed. So that's a very brief outline of the main story, but there are loads of subplots. So this story is an example, it's a modern example of a type of myth that exists everywhere where there are human beings. The myth of the journey or the quest through which a character becomes the person they could be, the potential they could be, and becomes a much bigger person in the process and transforms the world. And that's the journey or quest that Sangharakshita's 5 aspects illustrate. So I'd like to look now just at that first aspect, the integration, becoming a whole person rather than a bundle of conflicting desires. Well, to integrate ourselves, we need to own up to and get to know our darker motivations and our grungier emotions. Usually, most of us think we're really nice people. We turn a blind eye to our greed, our ill will, our competitiveness, our sneakiness, our dishonesty, our anger, and all those things. So we see those things in other people clearly enough, but not in ourselves. We're really nice. So everything that goes wrong is other people's fault. We're usually not aware. When we start out, we really don't want to be aware of the less likable parts of ourselves. And while we're not aware of them, they rule us from the shadows. Only when we become aware of them, we can do something about them. And there's a lot of energy tied up in those grungier parts of ourselves. We need that energy. We need it as a helper. And this relationship with our dark side is portrayed in The Lord of the Ring through the relationship between Frodo and this creature, Gollum. Gollum was a hobbit, like Frodo, who once owned the ring and fell under its influence. He used the ring for trivial personal ends, and it has completely corroded his character. Gollum is what Frodo could become. He is everything ugly and dark in Frodo. All the nasty little seeds that could grow in Frodo, they're all fully blossomed in Gollum. So Gollum is full of craving, he's sneaky, he's dishonest, he's resentful, he's self-pitying. Gollum wants the ring back, and he's dangerous and he's tricky. So Frodo maybe should kill him, you might think. He gets the chance. But instead, out of compassion, Frodo treats Gollum with as much kindness as he can manage. And he enlists his help. And in fact, Gollum is a great help because Frodo would never have made it to Mordor without Gollum. He would never have been able to get into Mordor without Gollum. He would never have been able to throw the ring in the fire without Gollum. And because Frodo is kind to Gollum, Gollum almost turns over a new leaf. He almost turns over a new leaf. In a way, that would have been he almost becomes a loyal servant of Frodo. And in a way, that would have been the logical conclusion to that story as a story of integration, but as a novel, it needed something different to happen. The thing that stops Gollum being transformed and becoming a servant of Frodo is that Gollum's other loyal servant, Sam, isn't at all kind to Gollum, not at all. So Gollum is encouraged to carry on being resentful and sneaky. So we can see that part of the story of Lord of the Rings as an illustration of that aspect of integration, becoming aware of and befriending the less likable parts of ourselves that we don't usually want to own up to, even to ourselves, and getting them on our side, using them. And then another different aspect of integration is displayed in the book in a relationship between two members of the company that set out with Frodo to Mordor. These are Gimli the dwarf, I think it's Gimli, not Gimli, Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf. So this company has been chosen to represent, as it says, all the free peoples of the world, of which dwarves and elves are two. You could see this as all the different aspects of being human are in that company. And to be effective in carrying out this quest, all these different aspects have to be in harmony, not in conflict. So two of these are Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf. Gimli is a dwarf. I just said that. Dwarves are creatures of the earth. They live underground. They are rough and rugged and practical. They have incredible strength and stamina and endurance. They are solid and tenacious. They're also tenacious around their grudges and their loyalties. They mine metals. And they are industrious and skilled in making things. They're aggressive. The language of dwarfs sounds like rocks falling down a hillside. Very difficult to speak. Whereas Legolas is an elf. Elves are ethereal, refined beings of the air. They're light as the air. When they tread on snow, they leave no footprints. They leave no tracks. They're into music and poetry and the beauty of the stars and the trees and the living world. They're like creatures of another higher realm, sort of stranded in this one. They sort of look back. They always consider their true home to be this place in the West, ruled over by the figure, I can't remember her name now, ruled over by this sort of godlike figure, which is a sort of heavenly pure land. That's where they really belong. They're sort of sojourning in Middle Earth. So, elves of the earth, dwarves of the air and of the higher realms, elves and dwarfs don't get on. Elves think dwarfs are coarse and unrefined and aggressive, and they have absolutely no sympathy for the sort of nature-destroying industry that dwarves go in for, mining and manufacturing things. Whereas dwarves have no sympathy for those stuck-up, prissy, precious, namby-pamby ways of the elves. So when the fellowship sets out, Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf are often at each other's throats. But partway through the journey, something happens to Gimli that changes all of that. The fellowship needs to pass through the elf kingdom, the elf land rather, of Lothlorien, which is ruled over by the elf queen, Galadriel. Gimli does not want to go into Galadriel's realm. As far as he's concerned, Galadriel is a witch with evil intent. Galadriel is a ring bearer. She wields one of the magic rings that the elves forged long, long ago, which gives her great power. And she uses that power to create in Lothlorien a sort of heaven realm, a pure land of great wonder and beauty. Time stands still in Lothlorien. Lothlorien exists, as it were, in a different dimension outside of time. When Frodo enters Lothlorien, the book tells us that he felt as though he had stepped over into a bridge of time, into a corner of the elder days when everything was brighter and more wonderful, and that he is now walking in a world that is no more. When Frodo gets deeper into Lothlorien, at one point he stands in wonder. He stands in wonder. And the book says it seemed to him that he had stepped through a high window that looked onto a vanished world. A light was on this world for which he had no name. He sees all the usual colours, but they're all just completely different, as though he'd seen them for the first time. They're just wonderful. And Sam, Frodo's faithful servant, just stands with his jaw dropped to the floor. And he says, I feel as if I were inside a song, if you know what I mean, if you take my meaning. And then the elf that's accompanying them says, you feel the power of the lady. So all of this land, this wonder, it's an expression of Galadriel. It's an emanation of Galadriel's mind, her soul, if you like. It is her pure land. She's creating it by her power. And when they meet Galadriel, she's described as tall, grave, and beautiful, clad wholly in white with hair of shining gold. And the book tells us there was no sign of age on her, except in the depths of her eyes, which were keen as starlight and yet profound, the wells of deep memory. So she's young and ancient. And Galadriel has the power to see into people's minds and souls. And as she looks into the mind of each of the members of the company, she's looking for any impure motive which is going to endanger the quest and the fellowship. And of course, Gimli doesn't want any of this. Gimli resists this as far as she's concerned. He hates it. He's deeply suspicious of her. She's a witch. She's a witch, and she's trying to sort of look into his soul. So he hates it. He resists it. Galadriel's husband also isn't at all friendly to Gimli. He's an elf, and Gimli's a dwarf. And he brings up some elvish resentments of things that Gimli's people have done, which of course really annoys Gimli. But Galadriel defends Gimli with great understanding and compassion. And she speaks ancient words in his own language to him. And she smiles at him with great metta and understanding. And the book says that hearing words in his own language, he looked up and met her eyes, expecting to look into the heart of an enemy. But instead, he saw just metta and understanding. He saw metta and understanding and beauty and wisdom. And his face, he sees something of the higher realm that Galadriel inhabits, and his face changes from a glowering frown to an expression of wonder. We could say that Gimli falls in love with Galadriel, but it would be better to say that he falls in reverence with her. He has met something that he recognizes as higher than himself, that is related to him entirely through metta and compassion, but something that exists on a higher dimension and which he immediately wants to serve. In an instant, he becomes a devotee of Galadriel. He'll do anything for her. He carries a lock of her hair around with him as a holy object. He's immediately ready to leap into a fight with anyone who says anything against her. Suddenly for him, elvishness, this refined, almost spiritual beauty, is not something to be hated and ridiculed. It is something to be revered. He sees that it's higher than he is, and he wants to be its servant. And because of this, his attitude to Legolas changes completely, and they become firm, inseparable friends. And the two of them together become a formidable force. So this friendship between Gimli and Legolas symbolizes something important, I think, about integration. Gimli could represent what we might call our lower earthly nature, even our animal heritage. He's not refined or remotely spiritual, but he has great strength and enormous energy. strength and energy that we need to be effective even in our Dharma practice. And Legolas, we could say, represents the more spiritual, aesthetic, refined aspect of our being, the airy aspect, which we need if we are to rise above the earth and live in a more spiritual dimension, realm. Without Legolas, our inner Gimli is just coarse and practical and aggressive. Without Gimli, our inner Legolas is likely to be weak, overly sensitive, and ineffectual. As Buddhists, we probably identify more with our inner Legolas than with our inner Gimli. We want to be airy rather than earthy. But if we deny or dislike our earthy side, which we have, it will still be the enemy of our spiritual aspirations. It will undermine us, and we won't have its energy to serve us. We will stay unintegrated. So in meditation, especially when we might experience our inner Legolas, our inner higher self, from that point of view, we need to look on what we might call our lower dwarf nature with understanding and metta, as Galadriel did. That is the way Galadriel won Gimli over. That is the way we will win our inner dwarf, if you like, over to serve us. And that's looking at things as though we were Legolas, the airy spiritual being, which we might be in meditation, we probably want to be, but to be honest, we aren't angelic elves. In fact, we are probably more dwarf than elf at the moment. And so another thing to take away from this story is that Gimli, the dwarf, who we can see as ourselves, needed to find something higher than himself to serve in Galadriel in order to become integrated with Legolas, in order to dedicate all that strength and energy he possessed to his higher self, which we could say Legolas represents. So in order for us to integrate all different parts of ourselves, those different parts need to be able to look up to something within us that we can all respect, something higher than our ego, if you like, something that is not just another strand of our competing agendas. So reverence. Gimli falls in reverence with this higher being and serves her, and that creates this new, almost super being of Legolas and Gimli. Reverence is a very unfashionable emotion, but I'm tempted to say that we need to find something to revere, or at least to respect and look up to and indeed serve, if we want to become truly integrated, which is why the whole devotional side of Buddhism is an important part of the way we grow. So that's a little bit from the Lord of the Rings about generally about this system of the 5 aspects of the spiritual life, but also about integration. Thank you.